The other type of reaction that alkanes can undergo is called halogenation. It's a substitution reaction, which means you're going to substitute a hydrogen with a halogen. Again, there must be U light, so there has to be a lot of energy, and that's to break the bond of the halogen, because remember, the halogens, fluorine, chlorine, bromine, and iodine, are all diatomic, so we have to have a lot of energy in order to break those two atoms apart. Now, it does require a reaction mechanism, which means the reaction takes place in a series of steps. The first step is the initiation step, and that's when the UV light, known as photochemical homolytic fission, splits the diatomic into two radicals. So that bond that the chlorine is sharing here is going to split, and one electron will go with one chlorine atom and the other electron will go with the other chlorine atom, so that we get what is called a radical. And so these are radicals. All right, they are atoms that contain a single electron. So radical just means it has an unpaired electron. Now sometimes you might see it just written as Cl with a dot, and that's because we understand that the other electrons, the other lone pairs, are pairs, and that they're not going to be involved in the actual bonding or reaction. It's going to be this one electron that's doing the reaction, or that's going to do anything at all. The second step, propagation, this is when you use the free radical. There's lots of different steps. There's different reactions that can take place here. Sometimes they're called a chain reaction because it uses a radical and then it also forms a radical. So here we can see that the methane is taking that one bond between carbon and a hydrogen atom, and it's giving one electron back to the carbon and one electron back to the hydrogen. And then that hydrogen radical is going to form a bond with the chlorine radical. So we have those two unpaired electrons being paired, and that's how we're getting the HCl molecule. And then we're forming this methane radical because we have the CH3, and then we have that unbonded or lone electron left over for the carbon. Now that one electron could then react with the chlorine. So notice that this is a diatomic, and that radical can actually pull off one of the chlorines so that it forms CH3Cl, which leaves the other chlorine as a radical, which then could react with another methane. So it's just this chain reaction happening. The last step is called the termination step, and you're going to terminate it by creating products that don't contain a radical. And so typically you see two radicals coming together to form that stable compound. So a termination step, again, you're forming products that don't have radicals. So we can take that methane radical, we can take the chlorine radical, we can form that bond because of their lone electron, and we get our chloromethane. Now for the questions that you're going to, well, before we get to that, there is color changes that happen with this, specifically with bromine. So bromine, remember, is a liquid at room temperature. So it's brownish in color. That's what test tube A is showing you. So this is just bromine. We can use this to distinguish whether or not we have an alkane or an alkene. So you put the hydrocarbon, you shake it up so it reacts. If there's the presence of UV light, then we'll have that substitution with the alkane, and we'll get that clear solution again, because all of the bromine is now turned into bromide radicals and then is substituting out that hydrogen. So if the solution turns clear, you know it was an alkane. Now it has to be in the presence of that UV light. We'll talk about what happens when we have alkanes in the next discussion. So the possible questions then that are going to be asked about these substitution reactions is they might ask you to write a possible mechanism. And when they ask you to write the possible mechanism, they're not asking you for all the possible choices. They're just asking for a choice for each of those steps. So first we have our initiation step. So we're going to take our chlorine molecule and we're going to form those two chlorine radicals. So we're going to take that bond that they have and we're going to give one electron stays with one chlorine, the other electron stays with the other chlorine. And so that's how we get our two chlorine radicals. Then for the propagation, you could take your ethane here, your CH3CH3, you can react it with one of those chlorine radicals, and what we'll see happen is one of these bonds with the hydrogen, it doesn't matter which one you pick, one of them, the hydrogen will get an electron and then the carbon gets the electron. So really what you're forming is CH3 CH2 radical, and then you have the hydrogen radical, and then you have the chlorine radical. And so what's going to happen is the hydrogen and the chlorine are going to get together and form HCl, and then you have your ethane radical left over. Remember, for the second step, you have to start with a radical and end with a radical. That's how we know that the chlorine is going to react with the hydrogen and not the methane. And then finally, we need a termination step. So we can take that ethane radical and we can react it with the other chlorine. Remember, we formed two chlorine radicals from step one. And so those two lone electrons are going to pair together, and that's how we make the chloroethane. Again, you don't have to show all possible steps. You just have to give one step for each of them.